Chapter 3, Unit 3, Development and Learning. Part 3.1, Themes and Methods in Developmental Psychology. What is developmental psychology, really? All right, let's start here. Imagine you're watching a time-lapse video of a single human being, from a tiny cluster of cells all the way to a gray-haired grandparent rocking on a porch. Developmental psychology is the science behind that entire video. It's the study of how we change and how we stay the same across the entire lifespan. And I want you to notice that phrase, entire lifespan, because that's one of the first things the AP exam loves to test. Developmental psychology isn't just about babies and toddlers. It spans conception to death, cradle to grave, and everything in between. The three big developmental domains. Now, when psychologists study development, they tend to organize their observations into three broad categories, or domains. Think of them like three lenses on the same camera. The first is physical development, the changes in your body, your brain, your motor skills. The second is cognitive development, how your thinking, memory, language, and problem-solving abilities evolve over time. The third is social and emotional development, how you form relationships, understand emotions, and develop your sense of identity. On the AP exam, you'll often see a scenario and need to identify which domain it falls into. If a question tells you a toddler just learned to walk, that's physical. If it tells you a teenager is figuring out who they are, that's social emotional. Keep those three lenses in your toolkit. The nature versus nurture debate. Here's where things get philosophically juicy and exam-worthy. One of the oldest and most central debates in developmental psychology is the true nature versus nurture question. Nature refers to our genetic inheritance, our biology, the blueprint we're born with. Nurture refers to the environment, our upbringing, our culture, our experiences. The AP exam isn't looking for you to pick a side, because here's the modern consensus. It's always both. The field has largely moved toward what's called an acingist perspective, which says that nature and nurture work together, constantly influencing each other. Your genes might predispose you toward anxiety, but whether that anxiety fully develops depends enormously on your environment. Think of it like a seed in soil. The seed is your nature, the soil is your nurture, and neither one alone produces the tree. Continuity versus discontinuity. Another major theme you need to know is the debate between continuity as development, a smooth, gradual slope like a ramp, or does it happen in distinct, dramatic leaps like a staircase? Continuity theorists argue development is incremental and ongoing. Discontinuity theorists argue development is incremental and ongoing. Discontinuity theorists argue development happens in clearly defined stages where each stage is qualitatively different from the one before. Jean Piaget's stages of cognitive development, which you'll meet soon, is a classic example of a discontinuity model. This distinction shows up on the AP exam in subtle ways. If you see a question about stage theories, you're in discontinuity territory. Stability versus change. A third recurring theme asks, does our personality stay basically the same over a lifetime? Or are we fundamentally different people at 525 and 75? Research suggests the answer is nuanced. Some traits, like basic temperament, show remarkable stability, while others can shift considerably with experience. The AP exam sometimes presents this as a conceptual question, so just remember, stability and change coexist in development. Research methods. This is a big one for the exam. Now let's talk methodology, because this is absolutely a place where AP students lose points. When researchers study development across age, they essentially have two main strategies. The first is a cross-sectional study where you take a snapshot of different age groups at the same point in time. For example, comparing 10-year-olds, 30-year-olds, and 60-year-olds and 60-year-olds all in the same study right now. It's fast and cost-effective. But the big weakness is the open cohort effect. People born in different eras had different experiences growing up. So you might be measuring historical differences, not true developmental change. The second approach is a longitudinal study, where you follow the same group of people over a long period of time. This gives you rich, authentic data about how individuals change, but it's expensive, time-consuming, and you lose participants along the way, a problem called attrition. Here's your AP pitfall. Students often confuse which design is which. Remember it this way. Longitudinal is long. It takes a it takes a long time, and you follow the same people. Cross-sectional cuts across your district, different groups all at once, like a cross-section of a tree. There's also a hybrid called a cross-sequential design, sometimes called cohort sequential, which tries to combine the strengths of both by following multiple age groups over time simultaneously. It's less commonly tested, but worth knowing it exists. Quick word on teratogens. While we're talking methods and foundations, don't forget teratogens, environmental agents like alcohol, drugs, or certain infections that can harm prenatal development. Fetal alcohol syndrome is the most commonly tested example. The AP exam may ask you to connect teratogen exposure to specific developmental outcomes, so keep that connection tight. With our foundational framework now solid, the domains, the big debates, and the research tools, we're perfectly set up to dive into one of the most famous frameworks in all of psychology, Piaget's stages of cognitive development. Part 3.2, Physical Development Across the Lifespan. All right, let's talk about how your body goes from a single fertilized cell to a fully formed human being, and then keeps changing all the way into old age. This is one of those topics where the AP exam loves to test whether you understand sequence and timing, not just vocabulary. So let's build this picture carefully, starting at the very beginning. Prenatal development, the first blueprint. Imagine you're watching a time lapse of a skyscraper being built. In the first few weeks, the foundation goes down, invisible to passersby, but absolutely essential. That's your germinal stage, the first 2 weeks after fertilization, when the zygote is rapidly dividing and implanting into the uterine wall. Then comes the embryonic stage of weeks 2 through 8, where the basic architecture of all major organ systems begins to form. This is the most vulnerable period for teratogens, harmful agents like alcohol, certain drugs or infections that can disrupt development. A common AP pitfall here is forgetting that teratogens do the most damage during the embryonic stage precisely because the organs are forming for the first time. The fifth stage, week 9 through birth, is less about building new systems and more about growth and refinement, the skyscrapers going up floor by floor. One concept the AP exam adores is ISRIFTRA, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, FASD, caused by prenatal alcohol exposure. It's a perfect real-world example of how environmental factors shape biological development before a child ever takes their first breath. Infancy and childhood, the explosive years. Now picture a brand new smartphone, fresh out of the box. The hardware is there, but the software is still installing. That's your infant's brain. At birth, a baby has nearly all the neurons they'll ever have, roughly 100 billion. But the synaptic connections between them are sparse. What happens next is extraordinary, a process called synaptic pruning, where the brain eliminates connections that aren't being used and strengthens the ones that use it or lose it. Literally, motor development follows a reliable sequence that the AP exam tests regularly. Infants gain control from the FAT, head downwards, Infants gain control from the F, head downward. So, these sequences are universal. They show up across all cultures, which tells us they're driven by biological maturation, not just practice or environment. Reflexes are another favorite AP topic. Newborns arrive preloaded with survival reflexes. the rooting reflex, turning toward a touch on the cheek to find food, the grasping reflex, clutching anything placed in the palm, and the moral reflex, startling and flinging out the arms. These disappear in the first few months as the cortex develops and takes over more voluntary control. If an AP question describes a newborn behavior, ask yourself, is this a reflex or a learned behavior? Almost certainly a reflex. Adolescence, construction zone. Adolescence is where things get interesting. The brain is essentially under renovation. The prefrontal cortex, your planning, impulse control, and decision-making headquarters, is literally the last region to fully mature, not completing development until the mid-20s. Meanwhile, the other limbic system, which drives emotional responses and reward seeking, is already firing on all cylinders. Think of it as having a sports car engine with learner's brakes. This neurological mismatch helps explain why teenagers are more prone to risk-taking and emotional volatility. It's not a character flaw, it's a developmental reality. Puberty is triggered by the release of hormones from the hypothalamus and pituitary gland, initiating the development of one primary sex characteristics, the reproductive organs themselves, and secondary sex characteristics, things like body hair, breast development, and voice changes. The AP exam distinguishes these two carefully, so make sure you can tell them apart. A helpful mnemonic. Primary equals plumbing. Secondary equals style. Primary sex characteristics are about reproductive function. Secondary are the visible external changes. Adulthood and aging. The long game. Early adulthood is generally the peak of physical performance. Reaction times are fastest. Strength is greatest. Sensory acuity is sharpest. Then, gradually, things begin to shift. In middle adulthood, you'll see the onset of presbyopia, difficulty focusing on close objects while your parents hold their phone at arm's length, decreasing muscle mass, and slower reaction time. Late adulthood brings more pronounced changes. The immune system weakens, ABE bone density, it decreases, especially significant for women after menopause due to estrogen decline. And the brain begins to show some volume loss, particularly in the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. The hippocampus is key to forming new memories, which is why episodic memory, remembering new events, tends to decline more noticeably than procedural memory. How to ride a bike, or of the semantic memory, general knowledge. The AP exam loves this distinction between types of memory and aging, so keep it in your back pocket. One reassuring note, crystallized intelligence, the accumulated knowledge and wisdom you've built over a lifetime actually holds steady or even improves well into old age. It's unfluid intelligence, the raw ability to solve novel problems quickly, that declines. Think of crystallized intelligence as your library, and fluid intelligence is how fast you can read. With a solid map of physical development from womb to late adulthood in hand, you're ready to see how these biological changes connect to the psychological Part 3.3, Gender and Sexual Orientation. What are we actually talking about? Let's get something straight right from the start, and I mean that in the most clarifying way possible. When we talk about gender and sexual orientation in AP psychology, we are dealing with two completely distinct concepts that students mix up on the exam more than almost anything else in this unit. Think of it this way. Gender is about who you are, and sexual orientation is about who you're attracted to. They operate independently of each other, and keeping them separate in your mind is your first job here. So let's build this up carefully, piece by piece. Sex versus gender. The AP exam wants you to know the difference between biological sex and gender. Biological sex refers to the chromosomal, hormonal, and
refers as to the chromosomal, hormonal, and anatomical characteristics that we typically...
Here's a great analogy. Think of biological sex as the hardware of a computer, and gender as the software. The hardware sets certain parameters, but the software, shaped by culture, upbringing, and individual identity, determines how things actually run. Gender identity is your internal, personal sense of your own gender, how you experience yourself. It may or may not align with the biological sex assigned at birth. When they don't align, a person may identify as transgender. As gender expression is the external presentation of gender through clothing, behavior, and appearance. And gender roles are the social expectations placed on people based on their perceived gender, like the old-fashioned idea that men don't cry or that women should be nurturing. These roles vary enormously across cultures and across history, which is a huge clue that they are socially constructed rather than purely biological. Nature, nurture, and gender development. This is where it gets really interesting and where the AP exam loves to test you. Psychologists debate the relative contributions of biology and socialization to gender development. And the answer, as with most things in psychology, is both. On the biological side, research shows that prenatal hormone exposure has real effects on behavior and gender-typical play. Studies of children with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, a condition that exposes female fetuses to higher than typical levels of androgens, show that these girls tend to engage in more traditionally male-typed play. That's nature at work. But socialization matters enormously too. Social learning theory tells us that children learn gender-type behaviors through observation, imitation, and reinforcement. A little boy who gets praised for being tough and a little girl who gets praised for being gentle are both receiving powerful messages about who they should be. Gender schema theory, proposed by Sandra Bem, adds a cognitive twist. Children actively build mental frameworks, schemas about what it means to be a boy or a girl. And then they sort their experiences and behaviors through that lens. It's like they're wearing gender-tinted glasses that filter everything they see. Sexual orientation. Now let's talk about sexual orientation, which refers to the pattern of emotional, romantic, and sexual attraction a person experiences toward others. The major categories you'll encounter are heterosexual attraction to a different gender, homosexual attraction to the same gender, and a bisexual attraction to more than one gender. Asexuality, experiencing little to no sexual attraction, is also part of the spectrum, though it comes up less frequently on the exam. Here's the critical AP pitfall to avoid. FTA. Sexual orientation is not a choice, and it is not the same as gender identity. The American Psychological Association and virtually every major mental health organization have affirmed that homosexuality is a normal, natural variation of human sexuality. It was removed from the DSM, the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Disorders, back in 1973. Do not confuse being gay with being transgender on the exam. They are independent dimensions. What causes sexual orientation? The honest answer is that we don't fully know, but research points strongly toward biological factors. Twin studies show higher concordance rates for sexual orientation among identical twins than fraternal twins, suggesting a genetic component. Research by Simon LeVay identified structural differences in a region of the hypothalamus between gay and straight men. Prenatal hormone exposure has also been implicated. The key takeaway for the exam is that sexual orientation appears to be influenced by a combination of genetic, hormonal, and environmental factors, and it is largely established before adolescence, not chosen during it. The big exam pitfalls. A few things to tattoo on your brain before test day. First, you should never conflate sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. These are 4 distinct concepts. Second, remember that gender roles are culturally variable, which supports the social constructionist view. Third, conversion therapy attempts to change sexual orientation through psychological If the AP exam asks about it, know that the consensus is clear. A handy mnemonic, SGGGS, SGVRES. Sex is biological, gender is social, gender roles are learned, sexual orientation is who you are attracted to. With a solid grip on how psychology understands gender and sexual orientation, you're perfectly set up to explore the next chapter of development because, as you're about to see, the way we think about ourselves doesn't stop evolving once we figure out who we are. Part 3.4 Cognitive Development Across the Lifespan. Let's talk about how your mind grows, not just in childhood, but across your entire life, because cognitive development doesn't stop when you graduate high school. And the AP exam absolutely wants you to know that. Piaget's stages of cognitive development. The undisputed heavyweight of this topic is Jean Piaget, a Swiss psychologist who essentially invented the scientific study of how children think. His core insight was beautifully simple. Children aren't just small adults with less information. They think in fundamentally different ways depending on their age. Piaget called the mental frameworks we use to organize and interpret the world schemas, and he described two processes by which those schemas change. Assimilation is when you fit new information into an existing schema, like a toddler calling every four-legged animal a doggy. Accommodation is when the new information is so different that you have to reshape or create a schema entirely. The moment that toddler meets a cat and realizes not every four-legged creature barks, Piaget organized development into 4 stages. And you need these called. The first is the any sensorimotor stage, birth to about age 2, where infants learn by touching, tasting, and manipulating their environment. The landmark achievement here is NE object permanence, the understanding that things continue to exist even when you can't see them. Before this clicks, a hidden toy simply ceases to exist for the baby. Once it clicks, the baby will search for it. Think of it as the moment the world becomes permanent rather than a magic show. Next comes the bilio-preoperational stage, roughly ages 2 to 7. Language explodes, imagination flourishes, and children engage in symbolic thinking, using words and images to represent objects. But here's the catch. Children in this stage are deeply egocentric, meaning they struggle to take another person's perspective. This is not selfishness. It's a cognitive limitation. They also lack bilioconservation, the understanding that quantity stays the same even when the appearance changes. Pour the same amount of water into a tall, thin glass and a short, wide glass, and a pre-operational child insists the tall glass has more. They're fooled by appearance because they can't yet perform mental operations to reverse the change in their minds. The Guanantuan child at this stage can grasp that your tall glass and their short glass hold the same water. They can also perform a seriation of arranging objects by size and understand root transitivity is abstract thinking, though. Not yet. That arrives in the formal operational stage, age 12 and beyond, when adolescents gain the ability to think. Abstract thinking, though. Not yet. That arrives in the formal operational stage, age of 12 and beyond, when adolescents gain the ability to think abstractly, reason, hypothetically, and consider possibilities that don't exist in the physical world. Algebra, philosophical debate, what-if scenarios, these all require formal operational thinking. A classic A pitfall here is confusing egocentrism with selfishness. Remember, it's about perspective-taking ability, not moral character. Another trap is assuming everyone reaches formal operations at the same age, or even at all. Piaget himself acknowledged that not everyone fully develops this stage. Vygotsky and the Social Mind, where Piaget emphasized the child as a little scientist discovering the world alone. In Vygotsky argued that cognitive development is fundamentally social. His most testable concept is the zone of proximal development, ZPD, the sweet spot between what a learner can do independently and what they can do with guidance. Think of it as your learning edge. The support provided within the ZPD is called information processing, and lifespan changes beyond Piaget and Vygotsky. The AP exam also expects you to understand cognitive development through an information processing lens. Think of the brain as a computer that gets faster and more efficient over time. Processing speed increases through childhood and adolescence. Working memory capacity expands. And thinking about your own thinking develops significantly in adolescence. That's why teenagers can suddenly reflect on how they study or why they made a decision. And development doesn't stop at adulthood. As people age, crystallized intelligence, accumulated knowledge, and verbal skills tends to remain stable or even improve well into old age. Your grandparent might still beat you at Scrabble 2. Fluid intelligence, the ability to reason quickly with new information, typically peaks in young adulthood and gradually declines. This distinction from Raymond Cattell is a perennial AP favorite. A handy mnemonic to remember Piaget stages in order silly people can't forget Jew. Sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, formal operational. Bringing it together. The big picture here is that cognition develops through an interplay of biology and experience, nature, scaffolding, nurture, you might say. Piaget gives you the roadmap. Vygotsky reminds you that other people are the vehicle. And the lifespan perspective ensures you never assume development has a finish line. Keep these frameworks in your mental toolkit, because understanding how people think is the foundation for everything coming up next, including how we learn, remember, and yes, why we sometimes forget. Speaking of which, let's turn the page to learning theory, where we'll discover exactly how behavior and experience shape who we become. Part 3.5, Communication and Language Development. Let's talk about something you've been doing since before you can even remember: communicating. Language is so woven into your daily life that you probably never stop to think about how you actually acquired it. But for the AP exam, you absolutely need to, so let's dig in. The building blocks of language. Before we get into how babies learn to talk, we need to establish the vocabulary of language itself. And yes, this will show up on your exam. Language is built from several structural components. If this phoneme as phonemes or the word he the cats has two morphemes. Cat, a free morpheme that stands alone, and S, a bound morpheme that needs to attach to something. Syntax refers to the grammatical rules for how we arrange words into sentences, and the semantics is about the meaning of words and sentences. Think of phonemes and morphemes as the Lego bricks, syntax as the instruction manual, and semantics is what the finished Lego set is actually supposed to be. The classic AP pitfall here is confusing phonemes. Morphemes, remember, phonemes are about sound. Morphemes are about meaning. Phone even has the word phone in it. Phones make sounds. That should help you lock it in. How language develops, the milestones. Now here's where it gets fascinating. Children around the world, regardless of whether they grow up speaking Mandarin, Swahili, or Spanish, follow a remarkably similar sequence of language development. This universality is one of the strongest arguments for a biological basis for language. It starts before birth. Infants can actually recognize their mother's voice in the womb. After birth, babies enter the azibly babbling stage of Around 4 his to 6 months, they're producing all kinds of sounds, including sounds from languages they've never been exposed to. A baby in Tokyo and a baby in Toronto are babbling the same sounds at this stage. But here's the key. By about 8 to 10 months, babbling narrows to the sounds of the native language. The brain is already pruning, reinforcing the pathways it hears and letting the others fade. Around 12 months, most children say their first real word. Entering the one-word stage, sometimes called the holophrastic stage, milk doesn't just mean milk, it means I want milk. I dropped my milk, or look, milk. One word is doing a lot of heavy lifting. By 18 to 24 months, they hit the two-word stage, more juice, daddy go, no nap. These tiny telegrams are surprisingly efficient, and then, like a switch gets flipped somewhere around age 2 to 3, language explodes. Children start producing full sentences and demonstrate something remarkable called telegraphic speech. They include the most essential words and drop the filler. Much like an old-fashioned telegram, want cookie now instead of I would like a cookie, please. Nature versus nurture, the big debate. This is where two giants of psychology squared off, and the AP exam loves to test you on both sides. M.B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist, argued that children learn language through operant conditioning, imitation, reinforcement, and shaping. Parents reward correct speech, correct errors, and children gradually learn through feedback. It sounds reasonable, right? Then along comes a Noam Chomsky, who essentially said, that can't possibly explain what we're seeing. Chomsky proposed that humans are born with a language acquisition device laid in innate biological mechanism wired into the brain that makes language learning possible. His big evidence: children master incredibly complex grammar rules without ever being explicitly taught them. And they do it on the same universal timeline. Called this FT universal grammar. The idea that all human languages share a common deep structure that our brains are pre-tuned to detect. The strongest evidence for Chomsky's view is a phenomenon called 50 overgeneralization or overregularization. Children who have correctly said went for months will suddenly start saying goed. Why? Because they've just internalized the rule of the past tense adds, eder, and they're applying it everywhere, even where it's irregular. No adult modeled goed. The child generated it themselves. That's not imitation, that's rule application. Beautiful, isn't it? Critical periods and linguistic relativity. Chomsky's LUD connects to the concept of the critical period, a window of time roughly from birth to puberty, during which the brain is especially receptive to language acquisition. The tragic case of Ginny, a child who was isolated and never exposed to language until age 13, offers heartbreaking real-world evidence. When she was finally discovered, she could learn some vocabulary but never fully acquired grammar. The critical window had largely closed. Finally, don't overlook Ophir-the-Whorfian hypothesis, also called Ophir-linguistic relativity or the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which proposes that the language you speak shapes the way you think. The classic example: the Hopi people have no tense in their language, and some researchers argued this shaped their perception of time. The strong version of this hypothesis, that language determines thought, is generally rejected today. But the weak version, that language influences thought, has real empirical support. People who have a word for something notice it more easily. Language doesn't build the cage, but it does shape the furniture inside. Teeing it all together. Language development is one of those topics where biology and environment are constantly dancing with each other, and recognizing that interplay is exactly the kind of sophisticated thinking the AP exam rewards. Keep your building blocks straight, know your milestones cold, and remember that Chomsky's greatest gift to the debate was pointing to the child's own creative output as evidence. Next, we'll carry this conversation about development forward as we look at how early social bonds and the people around us shape who we become in the realm of social and emotional development. Part 3.6, Social Emotional Development Across the Lifespan. Let's talk about something you already know more about than you think. How people grow emotionally and socially from the moment they're born until the day they die. You've lived some of this. You've watched it in the people around you. Now we're going to give it a theoretical backbone so you can ace the AP exam and maybe understand your own life a little better in the process. Dirickson's 8 stages, the heart of this section. The single most important framework you need to own for this topic is Erikson's psychosocial theory of development. Erikson believed that across our entire lifespan, not just childhood, we face a series of 8 psychosocial crises, each one a kind of fork in the road. Resolve the conflict successfully, and you develop a psychological strength, what Erikson called a virtue. What Erikson called a virtue. Fail to resolve it, and you carry that unresolved tension into the next stage like a pebble in your shoe. Here's how to think about all 8 stages without getting them scrambled. Picture a staircase. Each step has a label written in the format something versus something else. The first step belongs to infants. Trust versus mistrust of mistress estrus. A baby whose needs are consistently met by a caregiver learns that the world is safe. The virtue gained is hope. Baby left to cry endlessly learns the opposite. The AP exam loves to tie this stage back to Harry. Harlow's contact comfort research and to attachment theory. More on that in a moment. Step 2 is for toddlers autonomy versus shame. And doubt astray is a 2-year-old discovering the word no is not being a monster. They're doing the developmental work of building independence. Parents who encourage exploration nurture will. Over-controlling parents plant seeds of self-doubt. Preschoolers tackle initiative versus guilt. Think of a 4-year-old who designs an elaborate imaginary city and bosses all the stuffed animals around. That's initiative. The virtue here is purpose. Shut that child down constantly and guilt takes root. School-age children face industry versus inferiority. Is this it? This is the I can learn to do things stage. When kids master reading, math, or soccer and feel competent, they build competence. When they only experience failure, inferiority festers. Classic AP pitfall. Don't confuse industry with initiative. Industry is about skill and achievement in the real world. Not just imaginative play. Then comes the one you probably lived not too long ago, a titan. Versus role confusion. Erikson's most famous stage occurring during adolescence. This is where you ask, who am I? With the intensity of someone writing angsty poetry at midnight. The virtue is fidelity, loyalty to a chosen identity. Psychologist James Marshall later expanded this into 4 identity statuses. Attrition, explored and committed. Moratorium, exploring not yet committed. Foreclosure, committed without exploration, and diffusion, neither Middle adulthood presents generativity versus stagnation. This is your parents' stage. Generativity means contributing to the next generation, raising kids, mentoring, creating things that outlast you. The virtue is care. People stuck in stagnation focus only on themselves like a pool with no outlet. Finally, late adulthood confronts us with integrity versus despair. Looking back at a life well lived produces ego, integrity, and virtue of wisdom. Looking back with a regret breeds despair. This is why older adults who maintain purpose and social connection report higher well-being. They're resolving this crisis successfully. Attachment theory and early social bonds. Woven into these stages, especially the earliest ones, is attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and famously studied by Mary Ainsworth. Ainsworth's Strange Situation experiment revealed 3 primary attachment styles. Secure, child is distressed when caregiver leaves, easily comforted upon return. Anxious, avoidant, child shows little distress, ignores caregiver. An anxious, ambivalent child is extremely distressed, hard to soothe. A 4th style, disorganized attachment, was identified later and is associated with frightening or unpredictable caregiving. The AP exam often presents you with a scenario and asks you to identify the style. Focus on how the child reacts to reunion, not just separation. Parenting styles and their outcomes. Diana Baumrind identified 4 parenting styles that shape social emotional outcomes. Is authoritative parenting. High warmth, high structure consistently produces the best outcomes. Kids who are confident, socially skilled, and academically successful. Authoritarian parenting is high structure but low warmth, because I said so. Permissive parenting is high warmth but low structure, and involved parenting is low on both. A great mnemonic. Think of the authority as the Goldilocks parenting style, just right. Common AP pitfall. Don't mix up or sift authorities and after authoritarian. The extra syllable in authoritative is your clue that it has something extra warmth. Authoritarian is all authority, no warmth. One more concept to tuck in your pocket. Kohlberg's levels of moral reasoning connect directly here, especially in adolescence and adulthood. But we'll unpack the full moral development story in the next section, so stay with me because it's coming right up. Part 3.7, Classical Conditioning. The dog, the bell, and the beginning of everything. Let's talk about one of the most famous accidents in the history of science. Ivan Pavlov, a Russian physiologist in the early 1900s, wasn't even trying to study learning. He was studying digestion in dogs. But he noticed something strange. His dog started salivating before the food arrived. Just the sight of the lab assistant walking in was enough to get those dogs drooling. Instead of shrugging it off, Pavlov leaned in, and what he discovered became the foundation of behavioral psychology. What Pavlov had stumbled onto is what we now call the aclassical conditioning, a type of learning where an organism comes to associate 2 stimuli together, so that a previously neutral stimulus begins to trigger a response it never caused before. Think of it as the brain's way of playing connect the dots between things that happen close together in time. The core vocabulary you must know. Here's where students lose points on the AP exam, so pay close attention to the terminology. Before any conditioning happens, you have 2 key players. The unconditioned stimulus, is something that automatically triggers a response without any learning required. For Pavlov, that was the food. The unconditioned response, is an automatic, unlearned reaction. The salivation, unconditioned, basically means no training needed. The body just does it. Now enter the U in neutral stimulus, NS, something that initially produces no relevant response. Pavlov used a bell on its own. A bell means nothing to a hungry dog. But here is the magic. When you repeatedly pair the neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, bell with food, the brain starts connecting them. After enough pairings, the bell alone makes the dog salivate. At that point, the bell is no longer neutral. It has become the it-conditioned stimulus, CS. And the salivation it now triggers on its own is called the it-conditioned response, CR, a great mnemonic. Think of the C in conditioned as meaning created through learning. The conditioned stimulus and conditioned response had to be built through experience. The unconditioned ones came free. One classic AP pitfall. Students often think the conditioned response and unconditioned response are different behaviors. In Pavlov's case, they're both salivation, but the CR is usually slightly weaker than the UR, and it's triggered by a different stimulus. Same behavior, different cause. Acquisition, extinction, and the comeback kid. The period during which the association is being learned is called acquisition A. This works best when the conditioned stimulus comes just before the unconditioned stimulus, not after, not simultaneously. Timing matters. Think of it like a movie trailer. The preview, CS, needs to come before the feature, US, for your brain to make the prediction. But what happens if you ring the bell over and over again without ever bringing the food? The conditioned response gradually fades. It's extinction, the weakening of the learned association when the CS is no longer paired with the US. The dog eventually stops salivating at the bell because the bell stops being a reliable predictor of food. Here's the twist, though. Extinction doesn't erase the original learning. Give the dog a rest, then ring the bell again, And watch what happens. Salivation returns at least partially. Pavlov called this to spontaneous recovery, and it tells us something profound. The original memory is still in there somewhere, just suppressed. This is hugely relevant to understanding why people in recovery from addiction can experience cravings when exposed to old environmental cues, even years later. Generalization, discrimination, and real-world hooks. Once a conditioned response is established, it doesn't stay perfectly contained. Stimulus generalization is the tendency to respond to stimuli that resemble the conditioned stimulus. If you got stung by a wasp as a kid, you might flinch at bees, hornets, and even large flies. Your nervous system is casting a wide net. This is adaptive. It's safer to be overly cautious than to have to relearn danger from scratch with every new species. The flip side is stimulus discrimination, learning to respond to one specific stimulus and not others. A soldier trained in combat learns to distinguish a gunshot from a car backfiring. Your brain is constantly tuning its responses based on what's actually predictive. One more concept the AP loves, a higher order conditioning. Once a CS reliably produces a CR, you can use that CS to condition a response to a brand new stimulus. If the bell reliably makes the dog salivate, you can pair a light with the bell, and eventually the light alone triggers salivation, even though the light was never paired with food. It's conditioning built on top of conditioning, like a chain of associations. Why this still matters? Classical conditioning isn't just about dogs and bells, it explains phobias, specifically through John Watson's infamous and deeply unethical Little Albert experiment, where a baby was conditioned to fear a white rat. It explains why a song can make you cry, why the smell of a hospital makes some people anxious, and why advertising links beautiful people to products you don't need. The conditioned stimulus is everywhere once you know how to look for it. As we move forward, you'll see how classical conditioning pairs with its close cousin, operant conditioning, to give us a complete picture of how behavior is shaped by experience. Part 3.8, Operant Conditioning. The big idea, consequences shape behavior. All right. Let's talk about one of the most powerful ideas in all of psychology. The notion that we don't just respond to stimuli the way Pavlov's dogs did. We act on our environment, and then our environment acts back. That feedback loop is the heart of operant conditioning developed by B.F. Skinner in the mid-20th century, building on the earlier work of Edward Thorndike. Thorndike gave us the law of effect. Behaviors followed by satisfying consequences tend to be repeated, while behaviors followed by unpleasant consequences tend to fade away. Simple enough at a coffee shop napkin level, right? Skinner took that idea and built an entire science around it using his famous Skinner box, a chamber where an animal like a oh, oh, what? What Skinner discovered in that little box reshaped how we think about learning, motivation, and behavior change. Reinforcement versus punishment. Get this right. Here's where most students get tangled up. And honestly, it's the #1 AP pitfall in this section. The words positive and negative do ever not mean good and bad. In operant conditioning, positive means adding something, and negative means removing something. That's it. Once you lock that in, the whole framework clicks. So you have 4 combinations. Positive reinforcement means you add something desirable to increase a behavior, like giving a dog a treat for sitting. Negative reinforcement means you remove something unpleasant to increase a behavior, like a car's annoying seatbelt beep, stopping when you buckle up. Notice that both types of reinforcement, positive and negative, make behavior more likely. That's the whole point of reinforcement. Now flip it. Positive punishment means adding something unpleasant to decrease a behavior. Think of a parent giving a child extra chores for breaking a rule. Negative punishment means removing something desirable to decrease a behavior, taking away a teenager's phone after they miss curfew. Both punishments make a behavior less likely. A quick mnemonic to keep it straight. Positive adds. It's negative when something's removed. And remember, reinforcement always raises behavior. Punishment always punishes, suppresses it. Schedules of reinforcement, the slot machine secret. Now, here's where things get genuinely fascinating and deeply relevant to your everyday life. Skinner discovered that when you deliver reinforcement matters enormously. These are called schedules of reinforcement. And they come in two flavors, continuous and partial, also called intermittent. But it has a weakness. Once the rewards stop, the behavior dies out quickly. This is called a extinction. Partial schedules are where it gets interesting. There are 4 types organized along 2 dimensions, ratio versus interval, and fixed versus variable. Ratio schedules are based on the number of responses. Interval schedules are based on the passage of time. Fixed means the requirement is predictable. Variable means it's not. The fixed ratio schedule delivers reinforcement after a set number of responses, like a factory worker who gets paid for every 10th item they produce. You see high, steady rates of behavior with a brief pause right after each reward. A variable ratio schedule delivers reinforcement after an unpredictable number of responses, and this produces the highest, most persistent rates of behavior. This is literally how slot machines work and why gambling is so hard to quit. You never know when the next win is coming, so you just keep going. Variable ratio schedules are also the most resistant to extinction. Fixed interval schedules reinforce the first response after a set time period, like a weekly paycheck. People tend to slack off right after receiving the reward, then ramp back up as the next deadline approaches. Hello, students studying the night before an exam. Variable interval schedules reinforce after unpredictable time periods, like surprise pop quizzes. Behavior stays steady and moderate because you never know when you'll be checked. Key additional concepts. A few more terms you absolutely need for the exam. Shapings. A shaping is the process of reinforcing successive approximations of a desired behavior. It's how trainers teach complex behaviors step by step, rewarding each small move toward the goal. Primary reinforcers are inherently satisfying: food, water, warmth. It's just discrimination means the organism learns to respond only in specific situations. And latent learning, demonstrated by Tolman, reminds us that learning can happen without immediate reinforcement, quietly building until motivation calls it forward. The AP Exam Pitfall Hall of Fame. Let me leave you with the mistakes I see over and over. First, confusing negative reinforcement with punishment. Remember, negative reinforcement increases behavior by removing something bad. Second, forgetting that partial schedules resist extinction better than continuous ones. Third, mixing up ratio and interval schedules. Ratio counts responses. Interval tracks time. Skinner's work is everywhere. Once you start looking, app notifications designed on variable ratio schedules, token economy systems in classrooms, and even the way you trained your pet without realizing it. Now that you've got operant conditioning down cold, let's see how these learning principles interact when we zoom out to look at biological constraints, cognitive influences, and the broader picture of what it really means to learn. Part 3.9: Social, Cognitive, and Neurological Factors in Learning. All right, settle in, because this section is where learning theory gets genuinely fascinating.
We've talked a lot about conditioning, Pavlov's bells, Skinner's boxes, but the truth is, your brain is doing something far more complex than just associating stimuli with responses.
Today we're exploring the social, cognitive, and neurological layers underneath all that behavior, and once you see how these pieces fit together, you'll never look at learning quite the same way. Latent learning and cognitive maps. Let's start with a story. Imagine you've been wandering around your neighborhood for years, not paying particular attention, just living your life. Then one day someone asks you for directions to the coffee shop 3 blocks over, and you rattle them off perfectly, even though no one ever rewarded you for learning that route. That's latent learning in it. And action. Edward Tolman demonstrated this with rats in the 1940s. Rats who explored a maze without any reward still learned its layout. When food was finally introduced, they outperformed rats who had been rewarded from the start. Their brains had quietly built a cognitive map, an internal mental representation of their environment, without any obvious reinforcement. This is your first big A pitfall. Do not confuse latent learning with observational learning. Latent learning happens through your own exploration and experience. It just isn't expressed until there's a reason to use it. The learning was there the whole time, hidden beneath the surface. Observational learning and Bandura's AR arm. Now, you don't have to experience everything yourself to learn from it. And thank goodness for that, because trial and error with a hot stove only needs to happen once. Albert Bandura gave us observational learning, also called social learning or modeling. And his famous Bobo Dole experiments showed that children imitated aggressive behavior. They simply watched adults perform, even without any direct reward. Bandura identified 4 conditions that must be present for observational learning to work. And a great mnemonic to remember them is watch, or ARM, attention, retention, reproduction, and motivation. You have to notice the model's behavior, store it in memory, be physically capable of reproducing it, and have some reason to actually do it. On the AP exam, questions love to ask which component is missing when learning breaks down. So if someone watches a behavior but never performs it, ask yourself, did they retain it? Can they reproduce it? Are they motivated? The concept of a vicarious reinforcement and punishment is also key here. If you watch someone get praised for raising their hand in class, you're more likely to raise yours. If you watch someone get laughed at for the same behavior, you'll think twice. You're learning from their consequences, not your own. Self-efficacy, the can I do this factor. Bandura didn't stop there. He also introduced a self-efficacy, your belief in your own ability to succeed at a specific task. Think of it as your personal, I've got this meter. High self-efficacy makes you more likely to attempt challenging tasks, persist through difficulty, and bounce back from setbacks. Low self-efficacy does the opposite. It makes the mountain look impossible before you've even laced your hiking boots. Self-efficacy is built through 4 sources: mastery experiences, succeeding at past challenges; vicarious experiences, watching similar others succeed; social persuasion, encouragement from people you trust; and physiological states, interpreting a racing heart as excitement rather than dread. Students often confuse self-efficacy with self-esteem. Here's the distinction. Self-esteem is your overall sense of self-worth, while self-efficacy is task-specific. You can have high self-esteem and still have low self-efficacy about, say, parallel parking. Neurological foundations, how the brain wires itself. Here's where it gets wonderfully biological. Learning isn't just a psychological event. It literally changes your brain. The principle underlying this is called ESHLA, long-term potentiation, LTP. When neurons fire together repeatedly, the synaptic connection between them strengthens. Neuroscientist Donald Hebb captured this beautifully. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Every time you review a concept, rehearse a skill, or replay a memory, you're physically reinforcing neural pathways. This is why practice matters neurologically, not just motivationally. Sleep is also essential here. The brain consolidates memories during sleep, essentially filing away what you learned during the day into long-term storage. Pulling an all-nighter before an exam actively works against this process. Insight learning. One more cognitive gem is insight learning, best demonstrated by Wolfgang Kohler's chimpanzee sultan, who suddenly stacked boxes to reach a banana after a period of apparent inaction. There's no gradual shaping here. It's the classic aha moment, a sudden reorganization of information into a solution. You've experienced this yourself, probably in the shower or right before you fall asleep. The brain is still working even when you think you've given up. Bringing it all together. What unifies all of these concepts is a simple but powerful idea. Learning is not a passive process that just happens to you. It involves your social environment, your mental representations, your beliefs about yourself, and the literal architecture of your nervous system. Behaviorism gave us the foundation, but the cognitive and neurological revolution showed us the building on top of it. As we move into the next section, we'll zoom in even further on how memory works, how information gets encoded, stored, and retrieved. And you'll see how everything we've discussed today feeds directly into